There is a kind of land that farmers talk about in the winter, the kind they mention not because they want it, but because it keeps coming up. Land that sits at the edge of the county map, bordered by a creek that overflows twice a decade, and a ridge that puts everything in shadow by 3 in the afternoon. Land that looks promising from the road and defeats you the moment you put iron into it. Land with a history, not a good one. The Caldwell bottom parcel was 680 acres of that kind of land. It sat between two operating farms, the Renner operation to the north, which had ignored it for 30 years, and the Harwick family ground to the south, which had looked at it twice and walked away twice. Between those two working outfits, 680 acres of reclaimed bottomland sat idle and cheap, sucking up water every spring, baking into something close to concrete by July, and offering nothing to anybody who tried to work it in the years between. 3 operators had looked at that parcel in the previous 4 years. 3 of them had done their soil tests, walked the corners, done the math, and declined. One of them told the county land trust flat out that the ground wasn't farmable without $200,000 in drainage tile alone, and even then you were gambling against the creek. Dale Merriman was not any of those 3 operators. He was 58 years old. He had been farming his own ground since he was 31, when he bought out his uncle's retiring operation and took on enough debt to make most men lose sleep for a decade. He did not lose sleep. He worked. He made payments. He paid off the note 7 years early. He was not the loudest man at the co-op or the one who showed up at every auction with something to prove. He was the kind of farmer who understood that the land didn't care about your opinion of it. You either figured out what the land needed or you got humbled by it. Those were the only 2 outcomes. He had been figuring out land his entire adult life, and he was good at it. But the Caldwell bottom parcel was a different conversation. He had looked at it once before, 2 years earlier, and he had walked away like the others. Not because the ground was impossible. He didn't believe in impossible ground, but because the timing wasn't right. The equipment wasn't right. His operation wasn't positioned to absorb the kind of risk that parcel represented. So he walked away. He kept working his home ground. He kept watching the Caldwell parcel sit there, unclaimed, underpriced, getting cheaper every year because nobody wanted it. Then something changed. In the spring of the year in question, Dale Merriman traded his aging tractor for a Massey Ferguson 8S 285. 285 horsepower. A machine with the kind of torque curve that didn't just pull, it pushed through, leveled through, ran through ground that would bring a lighter setup to its knees. He had been looking at that machine for 18 months before he bought it. He had test run it. He had talked to other operators who had run it in difficult conditions. He had read every spec sheet and talked to the dealer twice. And the second time he talked to the dealer, he told them what he was planning to do with it. The dealer's response was careful and professional and basically amounted to, "That is your call to make." Dale Merriman made the call. He signed the lease on the Caldwell bottom parcel in late February. 680 acres, cash lease, 2-year term with an option to extend. The rent was low enough to make the county land trust nervous, because ground that cheap is cheap for a reason. The trust had seen operators take cheap ground and burn through it, strip it, leave it worse than they found it. They put restrictions in the lease: no burning, mandatory cover crop in year 1, soil test required at end of each term. Dale Merriman agreed to every condition without argument, signed the paperwork, and drove home. The county knew within a week. That is how it works in farming communities. Word moves fast and it moves accurately because the people passing it along are not gossips. They are professionals who understand the implications of what they are hearing. When Dale Merriman signed a lease on the Caldwell parcel, other operators around the county understood immediately what that meant. It meant he was betting that the ground could be made to produce. It meant he was going to put a substantial piece of equipment into some of the most difficult terrain in the county. And it meant that one of 2 things was going to happen. He was going to pull it off, or he was going to fail in a way that was very, very visible. The Renner operation to the north had no comment. They had offered to rent the parcel themselves 8 years earlier at a lower rate than Dale ended up paying, and the land trust had turned them down over concerns about their drainage practices on the adjacent ground. There was history there, and the renters did not speak publicly about their neighbors' business decisions. But the word from that direction was not warm. The Harwick family to the south was more direct. Bobby Harwick told two people at the elevator that he thought Dale Merriman had made a serious mistake and that the Caldwell ground was going to teach him something that 3 other operators had already learned. Bobby Harwick had farmed his ground for over 40 years. He was not a man who talked without reason. When he said something like that, people listened. Dale Merriman heard what Bobby Harwick said. He did not respond to it publicly. He went home and started building his work plan. The plan was not simple. The Caldwell parcel was not a single type of problem. It was 3 problems layered on top of each other, and you had to address them in a specific order or they compounded. The wet corners had to be managed first. The hardpan through the middle had to be broken before planting, and the slope on the east end, which was moderate but consistent, had to be worked in a pattern that kept the topsoil from migrating downhill during the first heavy rain. For the wet corners, Dale had brought in a drainage contractor in the fall before he signed the lease, just to get numbers. Tile work was going to run over $60,000 for the worst sections. He didn't have $60,000 for drainage tile on ground he didn't yet lease. So he made a different calculation. He was going to manage the wet areas with field pattern and timing, not infrastructure, for year 1. That was a risk. He knew it was a risk. He built it into his plan as an acceptable risk, meaning a risk he had a contingency for if it went wrong. For the hardpan, there was only one real answer, a subsoiler run, deep and aggressive, before any primary tillage. He borrowed a 7-shank subsoiler from his brother-in-law in the next county. It was not the newest machine. It was heavy and it required horsepower to pull properly, especially in the kind of dense, clay-mixed subsoil that the Caldwell parcel was known for. The Massey Ferguson 8S was the reason that subsoiler was even a viable option. Without that machine, you were looking at a lighter pull, a shallower cut, and results that would disappoint you by the time you hit the season's first dry stretch. He started work on the Caldwell parcel on April 3rd. The first day was reconnaissance in motion. He ran the MF8S on a slow pass across the full length of the parcel, watching the ground, watching the wheel slip indicators, watching how the soil was moving or not moving under the tires. He was reading the field the way an experienced operator reads ground, not by the look of it, but by the feel of it. What he found confirmed his soil tests and also told him one thing his tests hadn't caught. There was a buried rock shelf along the northwest quarter that was going to make the subsoiler work more complicated in that section. Not impossible, more complicated. He called his brother-in-law that evening and described what he'd found. They spent 40 minutes on the phone talking through the approach for the northwest section. When Dale hung up, he revised that section of his field plan and went to bed. Day 2 was the start of the subsoiler work. This is where the county started paying attention. The subsoiler work on the Caldwell bottom parcel was not subtle. It was loud, it was visible from the road, and it ran long hours. Dale Merriman was in the cab by 6:15 in the morning, and he was pulling that 7-shank unit through ground that had not been broken at depth in years, possibly ever in that configuration. The Massey Ferguson 8S was doing what it was built to do, but doing it was not graceful. The torque was up, the engine was working, and from the road you could see the soil erupting behind the machine in a way that told experienced eyes exactly how hard that pull was. People slowed down on the county road to watch. That is not an exaggeration. Farming communities know the sound and look of hard work, and they know when a machine is being pushed and when it's comfortable. The Caldwell bottom subsoiler work was not comfortable work, but it was working. The shanks were going to depth. The ground was breaking. What had been compacted, waterlogged subsoil for an unknown number of years was being fractured and opened up, and by the end of the 3rd day, the difference was already visible in the way water moved after a half-inch overnight rain. Bobby Harwick drove past on the 4th day. He slowed down. He looked at the field for a long time. Then he drove on. The subsoiler work took 11 days in total. 3 of those days were partial days because of rain, which created its own set of problems, because working the ground wet sets back the tilth improvement you're trying to achieve. Dale stopped when it rained, waited for the surface to firm enough to support the tractor without excessive compaction, and went back in. He lost time. He built the lost time into his revised schedule and kept moving. Then the rock shelf in the northwest quarter found the subsoiler on day 9. The shank hit the shelf at an angle that torqued the frame hard enough to shear a bolt on the left outboard wing mount. It didn't destroy the implement, but it took Dale 2 hours off the field to fabricate a replacement mount from stock he had in his shop and get back running. He was back in the cab by 2 in the afternoon. He ran until 9 that evening to recover the time. No one saw that repair. No one knew about it immediately. But by the time the story worked its way around the county, as it always does, the detail that stuck was not the breakdown. The detail that stuck was that he fixed it himself in 2 hours and went back to work. That is the detail that changed the tone of the conversation around Dale Merriman and the Caldwell parcel. Primary tillage followed the subsoiler work. This was where the Massey Ferguson's power advantage became less about raw pull and more about consistency, the ability to maintain working depth without losing traction in the heavier sections, to keep the PTO load steady in the corner passes, to not sacrifice tillage quality chasing speed. Dale was not chasing speed. He was chasing uniform seed bed preparation on ground that had not been farmed at this intensity in recent memory, and he was doing it with equipment that could hold the work standard he needed. The wet corners were managed partly by timing and partly by accepting that he was going to lose some acres in year 1. The worst 2 corners, each about 8 to 10 acres, he left for last and worked them only after a dry stretch that gave him enough surface firmness to stay off the subsoil with his tillage. He applied the minimum tillage pass, built his seed bed as best he could, and planted those corners knowing they were a gamble. He annotated his field records, corners flagged, watch for emergence, expect variable stand. He planted the rest of the parcel over 14 days in conditions that ranged from ideal to marginal. The ideal days were long days. The marginal days were difficult decisions about when the soil temperature and moisture were close enough to threshold to proceed and when they were not. He made calls he was comfortable with and calls he was less comfortable with. He noted which was which. By the time he finished planting, he had been running essentially continuous field operations for 31 days. Not 31 days of smooth sailing. 31 days of hard ground, mechanical improvisation, weather interruptions, and the constant low-level pressure of knowing that the county was watching and that any serious failure on the Caldwell parcel was going to be a very public failure. He had one serious failure. It happened in the 3rd week, during a late evening pass on the east slope section. The MF8S went into a low-angle drift on a wet surface pass. Not a dramatic slide, not a rollover situation, but enough lateral movement to put the right rear dual into a shallow ditch at the field edge. The tractor settled. It was not going to drive out unassisted. Dale called his neighbor 2 miles up the road, a man named Edgar Prentice, who had a tracked unit that could provide a pull without tearing up the field edge. Edgar came. The extraction took an hour and a half. There was no damage to the tractor. There was no damage to the field beyond a churned section at the ditch edge that Dale subsequently repaired. Edgar Prentice did not spread the story, but word got out anyway, because 2 vehicles passed on the county road during the extraction, and one of them stopped. By the next morning, the story of Dale Merriman's tractor going in the ditch was circulating. By midday, it had been enlarged. By evening, it was, in some versions, a near disaster. Dale said nothing publicly. He finished his planting schedule. The planted acreage came in at 641 of 680. The 39 acres he left unplanted were the worst of the wet corners and 2 sections of the northwest quarter where the rock shelf had made adequate tillage depth impossible. He documented everything. He would come back to those sections in fall with a different approach. Then came the wait. Farming has a rhythm that outsiders underestimate. The work is physical and immediate in the spring, And then there is a stretch of weeks where the work shifts to watching, scouting, managing inputs, and resisting the urge to intervene where intervention is not called for. Dale Merriman was a patient man by farming standards, but even he found the waiting on the Caldwell parcel different from waiting on his home ground. His home ground was known. He understood its responses. He knew what good emergence looked like on his farm, and he knew what problems looked like early. The Caldwell parcel was not his home ground. He was still learning it. Emergence on the bulk of the planted acres was good to very good. The subsoiler work had done what he had expected it to do. The root penetration on early scouting was noticeably deeper than what you would expect on unimproved ground of that type, and the soil moisture retention in the broken subsoil was holding reasonably well through a dry stretch in late May that stressed some of the surrounding farms. The wet corners were mixed. One of the 8-acre corners had a stand worth keeping. The other had a stand that was thin enough to make him consider replanting, and he spent 3 days running emergence counts and making that call. He ultimately decided to leave it and manage it as a lower yield block rather than replant into deteriorating conditions. Bobby Harwick drove past again in late May. This time he stopped. He got out of his truck and stood at the fence line for a while, looking at the field. Not at the poor corners, at the middle ground, the bulk of the parcel, where the stand was coming in better than anything that land had produced in years. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. He did not stop at Dale Merriman's operation that day. But he made a call that evening, not to Dale, but to the county extension agent, whose name was Lester Vance, and who had been following the Caldwell situation with professional interest from the beginning. What Bobby Harwick said to Lester Vance was essentially this: "The stand on that ground is better than I would have predicted. I'm not saying it's going to be a good crop. I'm saying the ground preparation was done right." From Bobby Harwick, that was a significant statement. The summer went the way summers go, which is to say not evenly, not predictably, and not without decisions that had to be made faster than the information to support them was available. There was a pressure outbreak in early July that hit the county hard. Dale Merriman caught it early on his home ground because he was scouting every 4 days. And he caught it on the Caldwell parcel because he was scouting it on the same schedule, even though it meant more driving, more hours, and more expense than he had originally budgeted. He treated what needed treating. He did not let the scouting slide. There was a heat event in late July that stressed the crop county-wide during pollination. This was not something any individual farmer could control or prepare for in the moment. What you could control was how the crop was positioned going into that stress: root depth, moisture access, plant health from proper nutrition. The subsoiler work on the Caldwell parcel paid a dividend here that Dale had anticipated but not quantified. The root systems on the Caldwell ground were reaching moisture reserves that shallower, prepared fields around the county were not accessing. The yield penalty from the heat event was real, but it was smaller on the Caldwell parcel than the county average suggested it should be on ground of that classification. Dale did not know this yet. He wouldn't know it until harvest. But he was seeing the crop's condition every time he drove past, and what he was seeing was a crop that was holding up better than he had expected it to hold up under the July conditions. The hard conversation came in August. It came from his operating loan lender, a woman named Patricia Graves, who had been the agricultural loan officer at the regional bank for 22 years, and who was not in the habit of making unnecessary phone calls. She called Dale on a Wednesday morning in mid-August and asked to meet. They met at her office the following day. The conversation was straightforward. She had looked at the numbers on the Caldwell lease, the input costs, the cash rent, the equipment operating costs, the projected yield, and she had run the math with the current commodity prices, which were not favorable. Her conclusion was that the Caldwell parcel, on the numbers she had, was not going to make money in year one. She was not calling to pull his loan. She was calling because she thought he needed to hear that directly from someone who wasn't emotionally invested in the outcome. Dale listened to everything she said. He asked 2 questions. Then he told her the things he had seen on the crop that weren't in the numbers yet. The rooting depth, the moisture access, the condition of the stand through the July heat. He told her that the per bushel math changed materially if the yield on the Caldwell parcel came in higher than the baseline she was using. He was not asking her to bet on that. He was asking her to note it as a factor. Patricia Graves made the note. She did not change her assessment, but she did not call again. Harvest came in the first week of October. Dale Merriman started on his home ground, as he always did. Familiar operation, known yield expectation, manageable risk of surprises. His home ground came in where he expected it to come in. Not exceptional, solid. He moved the combine to the Caldwell parcel on the 8th of October. The first loads off the Caldwell ground were good, not extraordinary. Not the kind of yield that makes you forget everything that went before it. But good, solid bushels off ground that had been producing nothing, that had been called unworkable by 3 prior operators, that had cost him 31 days of hard field work, and 1 tractor extraction, and 1 sheared implement bolt, and 3 rain delays, and 1 conversation with a banker who thought he was in trouble. The wet corners came in where he expected them to come in, low, one of them barely worth the combining. The northwest shelf sections came in below average. The bulk of the ground, the 580 or so acres that had received the full treatment, full attention, full preparation, came in at a yield that was meaningfully above what the prior land classification suggested it could produce. When the last load came off the Caldwell parcel on the 14th of October, and Dale Merriman drove the combine out of the field and onto the county road, there were 2 trucks parked on the road shoulder. One of them was Edgar Prentice, the neighbor who had pulled him out of the ditch. The other was Bobby Harwick. Neither of them said much. Bobby Harwick asked what the average came in at. Dale told him. Bobby Harwick looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked back at Dale, and he said, "That's more than I thought you'd get." Dale said, "I know." That was the whole conversation. The numbers at the end of year 1 on the Caldwell parcel were not a triumph in the financial sense. They were close to break even on the cash operations, better than Patricia Graves had projected in August, not as good as the most optimistic scenario Dale had run. The ground had cost what it cost to prepare. The inputs had run where they ran. The yield was what it was. After cash rent, operating inputs, equipment costs, and a fair accounting of his own labor, Dale Merriman made a thin margin on 680 acres of the most difficult ground in the county. But that is not the point, and everyone in that county understood it was not the point. The point was that the ground had produced. The point was that the subsoiler work was done, and it was not going to need to be done again. The point was that the drainage management had worked well enough in year 1 that Dale now had a season of real field data to guide the tile investment decision for year 2. The point was that the land had a production record now, a real one, a documented one, and that record made the extension on that lease a different conversation than the original signing had been. He signed the extension in December, same rent, new tile installation plan for year 2. Cover crop seeded behind the combine in October, which he had committed to in the lease and which he had fulfilled without being reminded. The Caldwell parcel was not a finished story. It was the end of the first chapter. What changed in that county after October of that year was not dramatic. It was not a parade or a public vindication speech or a moment where Bobby Harwick admitted he had been wrong. It was quieter than that and more durable than that. It was the kind of shift in professional regard that happens when a man does something difficult in front of people who understand difficulty and does it correctly and absorbs the setbacks without complaint and finishes what he started. Dale Merriman had not made a fortune on the Caldwell ground in year 1. He had done something harder. He had proved that the ground could be made to work with the right machine and the right plan and the kind of patience that does not confuse waiting with giving up. The Massey Ferguson 8S went back into the machine shed in October with 700 more hours on it than it had carried going in. Those hours were hard hours. Subsoiler hours, wet ground hours, long day hours, extraction recovery hours. The machine had not failed. It had not given him a reason to doubt it. In the hardest sections of the hardest work, it had delivered what he had bought it to deliver. He would need it again in the spring. The Caldwell parcel had more to teach him, and he had more to prove. Not to the county, not to Bobby Harwick, not to Patricia Graves at the bank, to the ground itself. That is the only audience that matters in the end, and that is the only verdict that lasts. He was already planning year 2 before the snow fell. And the 680 acres of the Caldwell bottom parcel sat through the winter with a cover crop holding the soil that had been broken open by an operator who refused to accept that difficult ground was the same thing as impossible ground. The difference between those two things is not obvious from the road, but it shows up in the yield monitor every single time.